Hi everybody, welcome to week 2 of the intro sociology class at College of Alameda during the winter intersession. I'm going to follow up with you, finish chapter 8 with this lecture, and also give you a little bit of information about the course going into the second week. I realize that you were on the syllabus. It says that this chapter is to be completed on Friday. It's my fault that these lectures got up a little late, so I wanted to not have that impact you, especially going into the holiday for some of you. So we're going to tweak the syllabus a little bit, the schedule, so that it will all work out, and we won't be behind, and you won't be penalized because I wasn't able to get the lecture up. So I believe that we have to be fair about these things. I know when I was an undergrad student, I felt I didn't have the power. I didn't feel I had the power to say to a professor, hey, we're behind, it's your fault. It's not fair that you're, doing this to us. I never felt that way. So I try real hard not to do that to students. So let's talk about race, ethnicity, and minorities. If you've been paying attention to the news, this weekend there was an incident in New York City where 2 police officers were gunned down in the middle of the day in Brooklyn, and it is raising this question again, once again, of the criminal justice system and the systematic inequities that are a part of it when it comes to specifically racial and ethnic minority groups. So this is a really pivotal moment, I think, in society, because we are finally going to get to this question, and it's finally being raised as a national issue. What's going on with the criminal justice system, especially the prison system? So if we look at the way the prison system works, it's starting to become highly privatized, in that it's an industry, a for-profit industry. And when someone is convicted of a felon, they become legally disenfranchised from the political system and the power structure in the United States. Meaning that an example of that would be someone getting out of prison not being able to vote because they are a felon. Well, they're supposed to be able to vote at some point. There are studies that show that some individuals, when released, are eligible to vote, but they're not told that because it is commonly held knowledge that you are not allowed to do certain things if you've been convicted of a felon. But you do have rights as a United States citizen. And there was a study, like I said, last year that came out that showed that these individuals, once they've served their sentences, are not integrated fully back into society, and that's problematic. Think about it. If you had the power to vote, but you thought you didn't, your voice isn't heard, and you're not able to fully participate in society. One of the other reasons why this is problematic is because it affects 13% of the Black population, because incarceration rates are not the same across the board for every racial and ethnic group. So it is a systematic problem when we look at our democracy, and we look, some people, as a sociologist, a lot of former students and students today ask me, what's going on? It started with Ferguson, why are individuals so angry? Why are they rioting? Why are they doing these things? Well, a lot of that goes back to this sense of disenfranchisement, that the system does not treat everyone equally, even though it's supposed to. And that is the lived experience of Black and Latino men specifically. So there's a sense of unfairness, which I think there is a lot of disparity of equity within the system. Um, and once you're a felon, not only are you denied a political voice, but you can't go to school and get it paid for, right? You can't get grants and loans, student loans, if you are an ex-felon. You can't get a job if you're an ex-felon. My brother-in-law is, he has a felony record, and he is a very intelligent man, but unfortunately, he's working under the table to bring in income because he's unable to get into a job that gives benefits and a fair living wage and all the things that are associated with a good quote unquote job. And oftentimes, felons are not permitted to live in a certain area, right? There may be a question on a housing application. Have you ever been convicted of a felon, right? We've seen that time and time again on applications for employment. So this idea of disenfranchising this group of individuals is far, far more than just the political system. When we look at politics, education, work, and housing, I mean, that's like the big four. That's the way you come up in society, right? All of those things have power related to it. And these individuals are denied that voice. And interestingly enough, Black women face what we've termed colorism. And that means that they are discriminated based on their skin tone. And that doesn't mean that all Black women are treated equally. We know through studies, both through sociological studies and studies in the criminal justice arena, that women with lighter skin tone are oftentimes given more lenient sentences, and their prison time is shortened than their darker skinned peers. So there is evidence to show that this dynamic exists, and if it exists amongst one specific population, it mimics what we see when we look at racial groups and the criminal justice system. So white men are oftentimes given more lenient sentences and serve shorter prison terms than their racial and ethnic peers. So that's a pretty important concept when we look at what happened in Ferguson, when we look at what happened in New York City. Look at Oscar Grant here in the Bay Area. It exists. This exists. And to say it doesn't, I think, is creating more of a problem than if we actually realized it and did something about it, obviously. So we talked about what prejudice was. We talked about what discrimination was last week. There's a lot of other consequences to this that outside of the legal system. And we know that there's a higher level of negative birth outcomes, meaning that Black women are 60% more likely to experience premature birth, and 230% of Black babies are more likely to die before the age of 1. This is in the United States. And I want you to think about those numbers for just a second. And this is an issue. This is an issue that impacts this community. And normally these numbers are associated with women in poverty. And there is we talk about food deserts, right? Well, that's problematic when you're pregnant. You need to eat healthy. We know that. You can't rely on cheap and easy food sources like McDonald's or Taco Bell or any of those fast food agencies that we so often see in these food deserts, right? Um, when we look at the social epidemiology, we know that social statuses, practices, and problems are all associated with these patterns of health and disease. If you can afford to shop at Whole Foods, you're eating much, much better than even if you're shopping at Safeway. Now, if it was so much better, if Whole Foods was so much better for us than the food that we even purchase at Safeway, why don't we have Whole Foods on every block? Why don't we have healthy organic food that is affordable in these neighborhoods as well as the neighborhoods of wealth? You know, people, I have a lot of peers and colleagues that, you know, they only shop at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and, you know, because the food is so much better. Well, it's better if you can afford it, you know. That's one of the ways that this epidemiology works. People who make more money, people that live in higher income areas have access to better health and food choices than their peers who live in economically declining areas. Also, the access to health care up until the Affordable Health Care Act was very different. You know, before that came into play last year or this year, you know, people would, you know, women were pregnant and they might see a doctor in their second or third trimester. You know, it impacts those children as well because they're not, you know, children that are born prematurely, you know, experience health problems. It's a serious problem, and it's a direct consequence of prejudicial attitudes and institutionalized discrimination within the system. So, if we look at race and ethnic groups in the United States, I want to shift and kind of talk about the experience of some different groups. And I want to say right now, I put the groups in alphabetical order, just because I did not want to put the ethnic and racial groups in any other order, because I didn't want you to think that one was deserved more attention or that first position than another. Non-whites make up 38% of the U.S. population, and non-whites are projected to be the majority by 2020. That is the numerical majority. As we discussed before, you know, that wouldn't be, to say that they would be in the majority power-wise would mean that they, non-whites would be in control of the political system and systems of power. I don't think that's going to happen in 2020, but I do think and hope that we move towards that at some point, you know, in my lifetime. The majority of children under 2 years old in 2010 were non-white, meaning that, and that is directly related to that population increase. And when we look at population growth in the United States, we know that migration is really the main reason why these numbers are increasing, and that is, of course, in the Latino community. And by 2050, a lot of people have heard this number, a fifth of the U.S. population will be immigrants. So we're kind of opening up the doors, and we're saying, come on in. Or, you know, we're saying, well, we don't really want you here, but you know what, you're here, so whatever. There is a strong movement right now to close the borders. I don't think that I have to tell you, if you watch the news, that there's been a strong push to, quote unquote, send people back to Mexico and South and Central America, you know, breaking up families and things like that. But I don't think that we're going to see that number decrease. I truly believe it will increase over time because there is such a pull to come to this country. And wherever you stand on the immigration issue, um, I think we have to look at, when we talk about immigration, we really have to look at what the stereotypes around it are, because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of scapegoating voting that comes along with this migration pattern, the migration patterns of not just the Latino population, but other populations that come to this country as well. So the first group that we're going to talk about is African Americans. In this country, we have a long-standing history of slavery and forced migration to North America from individuals in Africa. So a lot of people think or want to think that, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. They came, the slaves came over here and, they were subjugated to the, and totally disempowered. But, they accepted their fate. I didn't grow up, but I spent some time in the South when I was in school, in grade school. And they never talked about this over 250 black uprisings between 1700 and 1865. That wasn't part of their cultural dialogue about the history of slavery, which I thought was interesting because I knew about that when I was living in Philadelphia. I knew that there were slave rebellions, some of which were successful, some of which were not. There is a dual history. And remember when we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, this double consciousness that African Americans or blacks feel, and that identity started to emerge during Reconstruction after the Civil War, and there was laws in play that said if you couldn't read or you couldn't write your name, you couldn't vote, right? You weren't allowed to participate in the system. Well, I don't think we really need to wonder if these individuals had access to education, the newly freed slaves. But eventually, black legislators were elected in every southern state during the Reconstruction era. That was a push forward, but you still have a white male power structure at the top within the system that could pass laws because they were in the majority. So that's where you start to see Jim Crow laws coming into play, where there is I hate this word, but there's a token representation of blacks from the southern states that are in the legislature, right? But you have the majority of those seats held by white legislators. So when there were laws concerning, voting rights or schooling or segregation, blacks didn't hold political power at that time to be able to stop any of that to happen. And these laws were oftentimes very violently enforced. When we talk about lynchings, we talk about the persecution, basically, of Southern Black Americans, and that's how these things were enforced, oftentimes socially, by groups like the KKK, and even with the criminal justice system, sheriffs, police departments locally. They were reinforced, and it was socially acceptable to do so. Along comes the civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s. And eventually, a group of laws are passed. We now refer to them as the Civil Rights Act, that made it illegal to discriminate against people, not only just on the basis of their race or their ethnic background, but on their sex or gender, their sex, male, female, their religion. Physical disability was added on to that later on, to make sure that everybody, quote unquote, had an equal playing field. Well, we know that, as I showed you in the first part of this lecture, that equal playing field hasn't been realized, because we see disparity amongst communities, and it's heavily based on race. I think, so it's heavily based on race. So when we look at the urban areas, in the Bay Area specifically, we know that, we talk about Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. Those are urban areas where the poorest blacks are living and trying to come up. These individuals really haven't benefited from the Civil Rights Act, right, where there's been an equality, equal access to health care, to good jobs, even to voting, because this is where we see high populations of incarceration rates amongst males. So when we move now into the 20th or 21st century, the Great Recession that hit disproportionately affected African Americans. These individuals didn't have jobs, had a really hard time finding jobs. They lost their homes because of deceptive lending practices of the subprime mortgage lenders. And these are mainly these individuals that are in the working class. If we look at middle class America or upper class America, they were impacted as well, but not at the same rate, and not for the same reasons. So that's why I don't think we talk about that group as much. So there you go. I mean, that's in a nutshell. I hate doing these groups, this part of the lecture, because I feel like I should spend a whole class talking about each and every one of these groups' experiences and how they're interrelated. And unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. I would like to say, though, that if this is if you're finding that this interests you, the way that ethnicity and race impact the human experience, I would take another sociology class on race or discrimination and prejudice. I think we offer that, I'm not sure, or social problems, or take an ethnic studies course, an intro ethnic studies course, because obviously they devote the time that these topics deserve, that you just can't do in an intro class. So when we talk about American Indians, we're not talking about Asian, Indo-Asian immigration. We're talking about the native population that was here prior to the arrival of Europeans. There were said to be about 20 million American Indians here before 1800, and by that time, by 1800, it was reduced to less than 600,000. This is a group that, when we talk about expulsion, definitely these tribes, these nations. I don't like using the word tribe. I like to use the word nation, because that is it's the nation. It's all of the individuals, regardless of where they were located at geographically, that identify themselves as part of a larger group. They were held to, moving on to reservations. The Trail of Tears is a good example of how expulsion led to genocide, and reduced those numbers even further. When the reservation system started, there were treaties that were made, both before that time period and after. And we have seen a resurgence since the 1960s of tribal elders and nations, resisting the United States government rule over their different communities, and they have forced the United States government to honor those treaties. There's There's a really famous photograph, and it says, something about the original Homeland Security, and it's a couple of Native American individuals, men, who are dressed in their traditional attire, and they're holding weapons. And, I think up until a certain point, we really never talked about the Native American experience, and the devastation that culture and those people went through, much like the experience of Africans coming over and becoming, slaves. That language was lost. Their native language was lost. The language that identified their culture. Cultural practices were lost. So as soon as a society loses language, their descendants cannot speak the native tongue of the people, that culture dies. And I think the U.S. Is very good at doing that to individual groups. And so the reservation system really has created a situation where Native Americans have very high poverty rates. They're the highest in the nation. It's over 50% of unemployment on the res. And only 13% of Native Americans go on to earn at least a bachelor's degree. Also, we forget that the tribal names of the nations that are used are not the same names that are used by the individuals in that nation to describe them, to say this is the name of the tribe or nation that we're talking about. A good example of that is the Navajo. They're probably one of the more popular references to Native Americans, usually the Navajo, but that is not their native name. It's, if you talk to someone from that nation, they are the Denai people. They're not the Navajo. And it brings up this question of who has the power to name someone else's culture? Who has the power to name what we identify these individuals with? I mean, there wasn't Native Americans, right? There wasn't American Indians. The name Indian came from, Columbus, because he thought he landed in India, right? So we have taken this on as a cultural reference, a way to identify a group of people, when in fact, we named them, right? The power structure named them. And this identity, the self-identification has become lost. So it begs that we have to ask this question, who has the power to name things and people? And it is those that are in charge, right? Those that are in the majority. And that is extremely problematic for obvious reasons. The identity of that group is lost over time. So the next group we're going to talk about is Arab Americans. Some folks think that it wasn't until the 1980s that we saw an Arab American population in the United States, and that's not true. The first wave of immigration started, or migration started in the 1880s. There's a high level of Arab American in the West, specifically in the Central Valley. That migration occurred, I think, in the first community was set up like in 1884 or something out in the Central Valley. And it was a farming community, for one example. And it ended shortly after World War II. These individuals came from India, and India is the big group that came over. There were also smaller groups of immigrants in smaller communities around the country, but the majority came from India. Now, in the rise of the Arab American population, we know that individuals who identify with this Arab American group or title were born in the U.S., and they can trace their roots to 5 different countries: Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Iraq. That is where we see more generational growth in their population. And when I mean that, I mean a group of people that have been here over the course of at least 3 generations. 9/11 is where Arab Americans had the social stigma and the discriminatory practices most noticeably. I'm sure it was going on prior to that, but they were kind of what we would like to call a hidden minority. We didn't really talk about the experience of Arab Americans before 9/11. But after that, there was a high level of stigma and discrimination, and I think individuals did this. There was a lot of crimes committed against those that identified as being Arab American, and institutionally. Look at the Homeland Security Act, right? Look at the no-fly list. There are stories upon stories of, children, 2, 3 years old that are on a no-fly list, just simply because of their surname. And I think we're still seeing that. I don't think that the discrimination and the prejudice has gone away. I think this group has also been scapegoated in the sense that we blame this population for many of the ills in the United States and the wars that we're fighting. And prior to 9/11, they shared in, a great, they were a model minority. They still are to some degree, but they enjoyed that status. And that meant that when we looked at the way these individuals operated in society, we wanted everybody to be held to that standard if you were considered a minority. And that meant get an education, have an income that was high, okay, be part of that upper middle class so that you can mimic that American experience that the rest of the world thinks that we have. When we look at education amongst Arab Americans, we know that 45% of Arab Americans have earned a bachelor's degree, right? And 28% is the national norm. When we look at income, we also know that Arab Americans tend to make 25 to 30% more than the national average when it comes to individual income. And there are a number of different reasons for that gap. And one of them is the power of the immigration experience itself. And we'll talk about that when we talk about globalization. Asian Americans, the next group that we're going to talk about. When we look at the transnational railroad, transcontinental railroad, when we look at mining here in the United States, we look at the history of the West during industrialization. Much of it was driven by the Asian American population, specifically San Francisco. We had an immigration pattern that went from China to San Francisco up to the Sierra Nevadas and beyond eventually. And these were individuals that helped to build the railroad to connect West and East. They were skilled in the use of explosives, and they were oftentimes maimed and killed, blowing out those tunnels, making those railroads up in the Sierra Nevada, trying to get through to the other side. In World War II, we see the internment and confiscation of property amongst Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. If you live in the Bay Area, you probably know Angel Island was not only the site of immigration through the West, it was kind of the, it was the entry point in the West. It was the Ellis Island of the West. People were held there, contained there, until they were deemed fit to go to San Francisco, health-wise and all of that. But when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, all of a sudden, all Japanese Americans were deemed to be against the state. So they were rounded up, taken to Angel Island, interned, and their property was confiscated, meaning any goods they had, any wealth that they held, houses, things like that. There was a stigmatization, much like the Arab Americans faced after 9/11. Very, very, very similar in the experience there. We know that most Asian Americans, when we look at them as a group, have a high household income. There are very low rates of divorce, teenage pregnancy, and unemployment. So there's been a lot of studies in different Asian communities, because if we look at Chinese and Japanese Americans, those numbers hold true. But if you look at individuals that come from other areas in Asia, say Vietnamese, Thailand, that isn't necessarily the case. Those numbers don't hold true. So I don't want us to think that everyone that identifies with an Asian American identity holds these numbers, because it does vary within the ethnic group when you look at that. So poverty and hardship, like I just said, are prevalent among the Southeast Asians. And the immigration wave that began, I think it was in the 1960s, 70s. Many of those individuals were granted political asylum to come over. And so they didn't have the financial resources that Chinese and Japanese Americans had, because there wasn't set sites for immigration. The first wave came over and they had to, they're still developing these social networks. When we look at the immigration pattern of many people, we know that they tend to immigrate to an area where that cultural identity is maintained. There's strong maintenance of it. So the primary language that is spoken in those communities is the native language. The foodways, the different businesses are, really geared towards supporting and maintaining that cultural identity. And when people migrate come over and they get into those communities, they have a set group of financial resources, social capital. They're able to communicate with individuals, find jobs, and then that's how immigration populations, and centers of populations increase over time. Latinos, as we've stated before, these are individuals that come from very different cultures, from Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. Their main cultural identity, the main identity they share is the Spanish language. However, different dialects are present. Just because you are from the Dominican Republic doesn't necessarily mean that you speak Spanish the same way as someone in El Salvador does. Just like English has its own dialects here in the United States, Spanish has its own dialects as well. There's 32 million Latinos in the country, over 32 million. They are the largest minority group in the United States, and a lot of their immigration wasn't in immigration at all. It was through the acquisition of the Southwest states in the 1800s as a result of the U.S.-Mexican War. So you have a population that was situated in a country, right, that belonged to Mexico. It was part of Mexico in the Southwest. And then all of a sudden, the United States takes over these lands, and these individuals now become citizens of the United States. And so when you hear this, the statement or the sentiment from Latino individuals that say, well, this was our land first, they're absolutely right. Just like, Hawaiian individuals who were taken in as part of the United States when that territory became a state in Alaska. Puerto Rico is very different in that it is a U.S. territory, but it still holds its own statehood. So we count the Puerto Rican people as part of our territory, but they're not part of the overall population of the United States, if that makes sense. They are, but they're not. But there's a flow back and forth between the two groups, or between the two countries. White Americans, European Americans. WASP is probably a term that you've heard of before. It's White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If we break that down, that basically is saying British. England, right? They're the group, the country that colonized the most territory in the United States back in the day. So a non-WASP would be someone that is defined as an ethnic minority and was marginalized. And that would be, the example here in the book, one of the examples is Irish Catholics that came over during the potato famine in the East. These individuals came over, and there was a stereotype. The Irish, they drink a lot. They like to fight. And these guys, they just like have a party. They're just off the hook, crazy. And they answer to the Pope. Our first president, our first Catholic president, was John F. Kennedy. And people didn't vote for him simply because he was the Catholic. The reason being is that we, white Americans, were afraid that he would answer to the Pope before he would answer to the American people. And it's interesting, too, we look at Italian Americans and their experience. Very different language, very different culture. They were Catholic. Many of them are still Catholic. And there were different stereotypes of those individuals as well. The only white Americans that don't have stereotypes and probably have the easiest immigration of all people are those from Australia, Ireland now, and England. You know, anybody that comes from those three places, I think, has an easier time assimilating because the culture is so similar. If we look at the cultural exchange between the United States and Great Britain, you know, we have a long-standing history of that, especially even in popular culture. I mean, I am a big fan of British comedies and British television. One of the big shows of the last year was Downton Abbey. Lots of people tuned in to watch that show. Well, that was a British show to begin with. A lot of the television sitcoms that we see today on television came from a British origin. The Office is another good example of that. Mistresses, one of the popular TV shows on, I think it was NBC, that comes from Great Britain. So there's still a very high level of influence that the two countries share with each other. Most European white Americans assimilate and are fully integrated within society in a relatively short period of time. And they experience or hold that term we call white privilege, right? We've talked about that a couple of times. And white privilege, again, is not about having resources and having money. It's not just that. I mean, there's a component to it. But at its very essence, white privilege allows you to operate in society without being judged, without being denied access to certain to resources, and you don't know that you are benefiting from white privilege. I remember as an undergrad, my first sociology class, when I learned about white privilege, I was like, what? No. I mean, I come from a working class background. I'm working, trying to pay for school. You know, I mean, how are you going to say, you know, I'm living, you know, paycheck to paycheck. How are you going to say that I am a beneficiary of white privilege? And I just couldn't wrap my head around it until I got into the field and I started to see the inequity in the system. And I said, you know what? White privilege at its core just means that I can walk into a Macy's and not be followed. And I could steal stuff. And the chances of me, you know, being caught or whatever are greatly decreased just simply because of the color of my skin, you know? And when I watch TV, the images, the people, they all look like me, right? As a white woman. Everything around us is European, white culture, you know, European based, I should say, white culture. And there are not good, fair representations in the media of the minority groups in the United States. Prime example, let's look back at 70s television for a second. You had different shows like the Brady Bunch that showed this great family. It was two families coming together, divorcee or whatever it was, and they were all white, they were happy, they were upper middle class. And then you look and you have a show like Good Times. And if you've never seen Good Times, I think you can Google it. I think there's some episodes on YouTube. I think that Hulu carries it. I know that BET plays it. I think it's BET. Watch a couple of episodes of that, and it really speaks to the experiences of the inner city black family of the 70s, where segregation still existed, economic opportunity was not there. I mean, the equity that was supposed to come from the Civil Rights Act, this family doesn't feel that. And one of the most popular characters that came from that was, can't remember his name, Jimmy, big tall guy. And his tagline or whatever was dynamite, right? I think white America thought that all African American or black families acted like that and talked like that and walked like that. And it sets up inequity in the way that individuals are perceived in the media. And as you know, that's a big socializing factor. It really impacts the way we view the world. And so, you look at that, and it gave white Americans a negative view into what the black experience was. In a lot of ways, I don't think many whites looked at it from a social perspective and said, oh, look at this. This is what's going on sociologically. And it was used as a comedy. It was a sitcom. And I really don't think there's a whole lot that's funny about living in poverty. I don't think that's a funny thing to view. Now, if you fast forward and you go into the late 80s, early 90s in television, you start to see some of those media representations equalizing a little bit. You had Family Ties, and then you had, which was the WASP experience in upper middle class America. Then you have the Cosby Show, and I know Bill Cosby's taking a hit right now. I'm not going to get into that, but for the first time, we saw an upper middle class black family, African American family. And we saw the way that they lived. We saw this experiences that white America could say, yeah, okay, I live like that. That's very similar to my world that I live in. And then you had, shows like Living Single, Different World, those types of shows that showed this existence that was not in lockstep with the stereotypical poor black family. But, as a white American, you were able to still look at media representations. And we find that up until very recently, the standard of beauty was to be white or light-skinned and underweight, right? All of this stuff comes in, and it really is defining who individuals are socially. We look at all of this stuff from a global perspective, and we know that the migration from North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe has increased over time. There are two different factors when we talk about migration. There's a push factor and a pull factor. It's real easy to understand what these two things are. The push factor is a social force that says, leave the country, go, take it, go out, go do your thing, that things are not good here. A lot of times that is social unrest, political unrest, economic issues, the great idea that if you come to America, you're going to have a much better life, part of the American dream. That would be a push factor to get people to leave the country. There's also pull factors, and that is those things that pull people in. Once again, the American dream is thought that I can do anything I want. I have access to education and income in the United States or other countries, because, migration just does not occur to the United States. It also happens around the world, and these push-pull factors are always a part of that. So with this migration, we see examples of new institutionalized racism in cultures that we never really looked at before. France, for example, when there was individuals coming in more numbers that were Muslim. France banned the use of the burqa, or the full face veil, for immigrants. You weren't allowed to wear that in public because they couldn't see your face, and it was culturally unacceptable. So they institutionalized that and said, okay, we're going to ban this. Not okay, right? That would have been a push factor for individuals that were in France and wanted to migrate out of the country. Same thing with the Rwandan genocide of 1994 to 96. Huge push factor, right? Get it out of there. You got to get out of here. And it meant that there was a large number of individuals from Rwanda that came to the United States. There's pockets of these groups across the country. It's not just in California or New York. One of the things that your book doesn't talk about, I don't think, is this term called the brain drain. And that is a phenomenon that is tearing countries apart, that are really not good for the sending country or the country of origin. For instance, if we look at the Philippines, we find that their citizens are very well versed in the medical field. A lot of nurses come out of that country. Many doctors come from that country. They have political unrest there, at least they did back in the 90s, in the 80s. A lot of Filipino healthcare providers came to this country, were able to work, and that's considered a brain drain. A lot of the individuals that hold social status and position in a country leave because there's better opportunities, or maybe there's a push factor that is drawing them out of their home country into another country. Another good example would be the migration of Iranian families to Britain and then the United States in the 70s, in the 80s, and even today. If you were a part of a friend of mine, her father was an engineer for the Shah. And when he lost power, they had to leave the country, along with many of the other people that have held social prestigious positions in the country. They had to leave, resulting in a brain drain. You had the brightest and the best of what that country had to offer leave the country, and it's a void. I mean, that's not to say that there are no universities, no education in Iran, but they're coming back from that now, in the face of everything that they've been through. So that is it for Chapter 8. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post up the discussion board. If you have any questions, let's put them up there. I mean, this is, like I said before, this is part of the Trinity, race, gender, and class, right? So we really want to make sure that we get a discussion going on about this and that we're good to go. Also, when you're doing your discussion post, please be respectful. In other words, not everybody comes from the stereotypical position that you think they do. Not everybody identifies with the ethnic or racial group that you think they do based on their surname. So let's just show a lot of respect for one another. But also, I want us to be very real in this discussion, because like I said in the first half, you got to name it, you got to claim it, and then you got to change it. And right now in this country, I think we need to change things. So have a great one. Looking forward to those discussion board posts, and we'll talk online. Thanks so much, guys.